Imagine opening a scroll so old its edges crumble at your touch, and finding a story you thought you already knew, rewritten, expanded, and whispered through the centuries, as if it were too dangerous to say out loud. In this hidden book, time is measured differently. Angels walk openly among people, and the covenant you've been told is eternal takes on a far stranger shape. This isn't a sequel to Genesis. It's a rival. It dares to redraw creation itself, to number the days with mathematical precision, and to place God's voice in the mouth of a messenger who is not Moses. Now let that shock drift into a softer hush. The pages no longer crackle but breathe. Candlelight replaces lightning. The noise of discovery slows, and you find yourself in the stillness of a desert cave where fragments of an ancient text lie waiting undisturbed and expectant like seeds hidden for millennia. Here in the low, murmuring dark of our shared curiosity begins your journey into the Book of Jubilees. It is a text that once stood beside Genesis, Exodus, and the prophets, only to be exiled from the canon and remembered by few. It tells of a world ruled not by chance, but by cycles, 49-year patterns laid down before the first sunrise. It names the watchers on the walls of heaven, records covenants forgotten, and times events to the beat of celestial clocks. As you listen, let the familiar stories of creation, flood, and promise slip into new shapes, as if you were walking an old city and suddenly discovering hidden stairways beneath the streets. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Tonight, the door opens. Step through slowly. The silence will speak. It begins with a boy and a broken jar. The story is almost too perfect, like something dreamed rather than lived. In 1947, near the cliffs of Qumran, just west of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib threw a rock into a shadowed crevice and heard the brittle shatter of pottery. What followed would change biblical scholarship forever. Inside that cave and in 10 others soon to follow, scholars unearthed hundreds of ancient scrolls, some rolled tight and blackened with age, others miraculously preserved. Most were fragments, some no larger than a fingernail. But among them sat something strange, a text once known, then forgotten. A text that told the story of the world through an entirely different lens. A text called the Book of Jubilees. At first glance, it looked familiar. Echoes of Genesis and Exodus drifted through its chapters. The names, the events, the patriarchs were all there. But the cadence was off, as though the melody had been rewritten. Everything was numbered. Every event dated with startling precision. Years, months, days, measured not casually, but with ceremonial regularity. The world, according to this book, moved in perfect sevenfold cycles. That alone might have been enough to raise eyebrows. But what truly stirred the scholars was what lay just beneath the surface, the voice of a divine messenger, speaking not in riddles, but in blunt celestial record-keeping. This wasn't oral tradition or prophetic poetry. It read like an ancient cosmic archive. The fragments of Jubilees uncovered at Qumran were written in Hebrew, much like many of the canonical Dead Sea Scrolls, which hinted at a troubling possibility. This wasn't some fringe Gnostic invention or post-Christian forgery. Jubilees was old, very old. Some scholars place its composition in the 2nd century BCE, possibly earlier. Its presence in the Qumran caves placed it in the library of the Essenes, a desert sect, known for their apocalyptic expectations, ritual purity, and hostility toward the Jerusalem temple establishment. That alignment alone suggested danger. You see, books aren't banned for being boring. They're banned for being disruptive. Jubilees didn't merely offer alternate dates or sprinkle in a few angels for flair. It rewrote foundational theology. It suggested that the commandments were older than Moses, that festivals were based on a solar calendar instead of a lunar one, and that the original covenant was bound not by human will, but by cosmic structure. This wasn't a supplement to Scripture, it was a challenge to it. Some early readers viewed Jubilees as Scripture itself. Fragments of the book were found in multiple Qumran caves, indicating it had been widely read and copied. For a community obsessed with purity and divine law, this meant something. These weren't casual bedtime stories tucked into clay jars. They were preserved with intent, protected from the elements, hidden from someone. But who exactly was meant to never read it again? The mystery deepened as scholars compared the Qumran copies with the full surviving version of Jubilees, preserved not in Hebrew or Greek, but in Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Unlike Rome or Constantinople, Ethiopia had never discarded the book. It remained a pillar of their sacred tradition, copied and preserved across centuries, which posed a delicate question if one of the oldest Christian churches kept Jubilees in its canon. Why did the rest of the Christian world not only exclude it, but actively erase it? The answer may lie in the political danger Jubilees presented. It promoted a vision of sacred time that rejected the authority of the temple priesthood. It implied that the custodians of ritual had miscounted the days. Worse, it made the bold claim that these miscalculations were not mistakes, but corruptions, evidence of a fallen system. To preserve Jubilees was to accuse the religious elite of cosmic treason. Not exactly the kind of bedtime reading the Sanhedrin would have appreciated. And then there's the matter of angels. In Jubilees, they are not distant abstractions. They speak, act, supervise. They are assigned dominions, rituals, and nations. The angel of the presence, the being who allegedly reveals the book to Moses, doesn't whisper poetry. He files a report. The celestial realm is bureaucratic, ordered, and terribly present, which leads to one of the more uncomfortable implications of the book. If divine beings were this involved in early human history, where are they now? Were they dismissed, hidden? Or do they still watch silent and unacknowledged, waiting for the cycles to begin again? The appearance of Jubilees among the Dead Sea Scrolls sparked renewed debate not just among theologians, but historians, astronomers, and archaeologists. Why had a text so rigorous, so numerically obsessed, and so rooted in ritual been so aggressively excluded? And why did it seem to surface precisely when the world was again re-examining its foundations? Some chalked it up to coincidence. Others quietly did not. As the dust of Qumran settled and the last of the scrolls were catalogued, the Book of Jubilees remained an outlier. Too structured to dismiss as myth, too mystical to embrace as law. It lingered in the margins, a ghost of a possible canon. One that never was, or one that almost was. Somewhere in those caves, wrapped in linen covered in dust, was a story of creation told by someone who wasn't supposed to speak. And now it has spoken. You've heard the phrase, history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors fear the ink? When a story poses too many questions, answers too confidently, and leaves no room for institutional compromise, it becomes a threat. And that's exactly what the Book of Jubilees became, a threat wrapped in Scripture. Not because it was false, but because it was precise. The early church had a problem on its hands. By the 2nd century, CE Christianity was formalizing its identity, choosing which texts would be sacred and which would be forgotten. The emerging canon needed cohesion, and cohesion thrives on harmony, not mathematical rigidity. The Book of Jubilees, with its numbered jubilees and solar calendar, didn't play well with the rest of the class. It didn't whisper divine mystery, it shouted procedural authority. Jubilees didn't just retell Genesis, it dissected it. It fixed dates where none existed. It made declarations about time law ritual and angels that were anything but symbolic. Imagine trying to unify a spiritual movement across continents only to find a rogue book insisting you've been celebrating Passover on the wrong day for centuries. That kind of precision is political dynamite, and it got worse. The Church Fathers weren't merely annoyed by Jubilees, they were disturbed. Origen, one of the most influential early Christian scholars, acknowledged Jubilees, but excluded it from the sacred texts. Jerome, the translator of the Latin Vulgate, ignored it entirely. Augustine didn't even dignify it with criticism. To them, it wasn't just irrelevant, it was radioactive. The book's ideas threatened to undermine the theological architecture they were building, brick by carefully measured brick. You see, Jubilees operates under a different theory of holiness. For Paul, righteousness comes through faith. But for Jubilees, righteousness is legal, cyclical, and traceable. It must happen at the appointed time in the appointed way within the boundaries of divine mathematics. There's no room for improvisation. Grace isn't the point, precision is. It's like comparing jazz to an atomic clock. One improvises, the other just keeps ticking forever. Now imagine being a bishop in Rome watching as Christian sects spring up across the empire, each claiming to follow the true tradition. Unity was already fragile. A book like Jubilees, if taken seriously, could break it all together. Its cosmic bureaucracy of angels, its rejection of the lunar calendar, and its claim that Mosaic law predated Sinai, all of it pointed to a version of reality that didn't need apostles. It needed scribes, celestial ones. The Jewish authorities weren't thrilled either. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Rabbinic Judaism began to consolidate its teachings, streamlining a fractured religion into a coherent legal tradition. Jubilees, with its outsider tone and calendar deviation, didn't make the cut. The Pharisees, who would shape the future of Jewish law, chose the lunar system, while Jubilees insisted on a solar calendar. It was more than a scheduling disagreement, it was a cosmic schism. One of the more obscure but telling debates revolves around the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. According to the traditional lunar calendar, it falls on varying dates. But Jubilees insists that it must always be on the 15th of the third month. No variation. No negotiation. And if you celebrate it on the wrong day, you are not merely mistaken, you are impure. That kind of rigid certainty doesn't make friends. It makes enemies. This wasn't just theological hair-splitting. In ancient Judaism and early Christianity, timing was everything. Sacrifices, pilgrimages, and fasts all revolved around the calendar. Whoever controlled the calendar controlled access to God, and Jubilees, in its quiet, relentless way, took the calendar away from the temple and handed it to the stars. The temple priests in Jerusalem couldn't allow that. Neither could the Church Fathers in Rome. And so, bit by bit, the book was buried. Not burned. That would have been too loud. Instead, it was excluded. But silence has a half-life. And somewhere along the way in the hills of Ethiopia, a group of monks refused to let go. They copied Jubilees, sang it, studied it, preserved it. While Rome canonized its 66 books, Ethiopia held to more. For them, Jubilees wasn't a curiosity, it was scripture. The Word of God no less holy than Genesis or Matthew. Their tradition never flinched at the angels, the watchers, or the solar calendar. They didn't see danger, they saw design. So we're left with a puzzle. Why did one of the oldest Christian traditions embrace Jubilees, while the rest of the world pretended it never existed. Scholars debate whether it was doctrinal, political, or simply inconvenient. Maybe all three. One thing is certain, the removal was deliberate. Jubilees didn't quietly fade. It was edited out. And that invites the question, what kind of book must be hidden, not because it's heretical, but because it's too exact, too uncomfortable, too confident in a timeline that others had conveniently blurred. You're starting to feel it, aren't you, that quiet tug of unease? The suspicion that this isn't just about a book or a calendar or a covenant. It's about control. And what happens when someone dares to suggest that history has been counting all wrong? The Book of Jubilees didn't die. It was silenced, which means it's still speaking if you know how to listen. You were told the world was made in 7 days. Light sky, land stars, life and rest, like a divine week-long symphony. But the Book of Jubilees doesn't simply retell this familiar rhythm. It rebuilds it, line by line, moment by moment, and always with a calendar in hand. If Genesis is a sweeping poem, Jubilees is an architect's blueprint etched with dates, durations, and an obsessive reverence for celestial order. Creation in this version isn't merely miraculous, it's scheduled. According to Jubilees, the first week of existence wasn't just an origin story. It was the template for all time to follow. 7 days became 7 years, which became 7 times 7 49-year Jubilees, repeating in endless succession. Everything God created was meant to be remembered, not vaguely, but precisely. Each act, each covenant, each birth and death had a slot in the divine calendar. Time itself was holy, and Jubilees insisted it must be measured, honored, and obeyed. And then there were the angels. Jubilees does not wait for the burning bush or the thundering voice at Sinai to introduce them. On the very first day before light and darkness are even named the angels of the presence, and the angels of sanctification are already there. They're not spectators. They're assistants, witnesses, accountants of the divine. It's a curious choice, really. In Genesis, the angels are mostly silent. They visit, occasionally deliver cryptic messages, and vanish. In Jubilees, they're embedded in the very act of creation, as if the cosmos required not only divine speech, but also divine administration. They bless, they observe, and they keep records. Heaven, it turns out, has paperwork. One particularly striking moment comes early in the retelling. The Sabbath, traditionally understood as the day of divine rest, is reframed as the day the angels themselves were assigned to their roles. The 7th day becomes the birthday of heavenly bureaucracy. From then on, time is divided not just between work and rest, but between the sacred and the profane, between the watched and the forgotten. The Sabbath is not just a suggestion, it's the axis of creation. This changes everything. If time is holy and the calendar is law, then deviation is rebellion. Keeping the wrong day is not an error. It's a fracture in cosmic order. Jubilees frames this with a kind of celestial anxiety, as if history itself is only stable when properly aligned. One misplaced festival, one forgotten rite, and the whole structure could wobble. It's not exactly comforting. It's meticulous, almost neurotic. But for the authors, or perhaps the angel dictating the story, it was vital. The deeper you read, the more you realize this is not the Genesis you know. Adam and Eve appear, yes, but they are dated. Their time in the garden is measured 7 years to be exact before the fall. Cain and Abel's story isn't just a moral parable. It happens in the 78th Jubilee in the 2nd week on the 4th day. The precision is exhausting and oddly beautiful. It's as if God is not just creator, but cosmic scheduler, maintaining not only light and life, but a strict itinerary. And here's where things get complicated. Jubilees doesn't just expand Genesis, it replaces it. In the Qumran scrolls, there are indications that the community treated Jubilees as authoritative, sometimes more so than Genesis itself. This wasn't just commentary, it was canon. For them, the version of creation in Jubilees wasn't an alternate, it was the original, which begs a rather unsettling question. What if the Genesis we read today is the abridged version? Some scholars have tried to dismiss Jubilees as an overzealous midrash, a kind of ancient fan fiction. But that argument falters when you realize how widely it was read, copied, and preserved. Its rigid structure, while uncomfortable for modern sensibilities, appealed deeply to communities who saw history as something not merely unfolding, but preordained. For those people, chaos was sin, order was salvation, and nothing was more sacred than a well-kept calendar. The obsession with time may even point to an older tradition, one that predates both Genesis and Jubilees. In Mesopotamian mythology, timekeeping was the domain of the gods. Calendars were tied to kingship and covenant, and sacred texts often reflected that structure. Jubilees may not have emerged in a vacuum, but rather from a tradition that saw the movements of stars and seasons as divine speech. Genesis gave us poetry. Jubilees gave us appointment reminders. Of course, this opens the door to controversy. If the stories of Adam, Eve, Cain, Noah, and Abraham are all anchored in specific years, months, and days, then their meaning becomes less about interpretation and more about compliance. There's little room for metaphor when the story is footnoted with timestamps. The covenant becomes a contract with terms, clauses, and penalties. A covenant not of hearts, but of hours. One passage often cited involves the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. In Genesis, they are created on the fourth day. In Jubilees, their purpose is expanded. They are not just lights, but timekeepers. Their motion dictates the sacred calendar, and their rhythms are proof of divine intention. You're not just gazing at the stars, you're reading the minutes of a cosmic meeting. And that perhaps is the quiet brilliance of this text. It doesn't contradict Genesis outright. It absorbs it, anchors it, fills in its silences with confident declarations. For those who prefer mystery, Jubilees may feel too sterile. For those who crave order, it is a revelation. And for those caught in between, it is a reminder that sometimes the past isn't lost, it's just better organized than we remembered. So the next time you hear the story of creation told in broad brushstrokes and gentle metaphors, remember that somewhere buried in parchment and lit by desert sun, there is another version. One with schedules, one with angels, one with deadlines, and one that was quietly and perhaps wisely left out of the final draft. Moses was used to strange voices. From the burning bush to the cloud on Sinai, the Hebrew prophet is perhaps the most frequently interrupted man in biblical history. But the Book of Jubilees adds an encounter you weren't taught in Sunday school. This time, the voice isn't God's, it's an angel's. And not just any angel. The narrator of Jubilees identifies himself as the angel of the presence, one of the highest celestial beings in heaven's order. In Jewish mystical tradition, this angel stands directly before God, closer than even Michael or Gabriel. He doesn't deliver messages to humans in dreams or disguise. He records. He remembers. He watches. And in Jubilees, he speaks. The entire book is presented as a transcription of what this angel tells Moses during his 40 days on Mount Sinai. According to this version of events, while Moses is communing with God, he is also being instructed by a heavenly scribe who recites the entire history of creation from Eden to the Exodus, according to divine records. It's a backstage tour of cosmic events, delivered not by the author of time, but by his archivist. Now, if you're getting slightly bureaucratic vibes from this, you're not wrong. The angel of the presence doesn't exactly speak in riddles or poetic fragments. His tone is clinical detailed and deeply committed to chronological integrity. This is the cosmos as ledger, not legend. The angel doesn't want you to feel the story. He wants you to file it correctly. This framing raises several uncomfortable implications. First, it implies that the version of Genesis we have is a sort of public broadcast, edited, perhaps even redacted, while the version given to Moses in Jubilees was the classified file. Second, it introduces a theological chain of custody. The information didn't come directly from God to Moses, but through an angel. That subtle shift changes everything. For centuries, Jewish tradition emphasized the direct relationship between God and the prophets. But Jubilees dares to insert a celestial intermediary, and not just for dramatic flair. The angel is named as the one who dictates the laws, explains creation, clarifies genealogies, and even scolds Moses on behalf of heaven. The tone is not warm. It's formal, as if Moses is being onboarded into a secretarial position rather than inducted into divine mysteries. There's an obscure but fascinating fragment within the Dead Sea Scrolls that mirrors this idea, a text called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. It also features angels dictating cosmic truths to patriarchs, suggesting that Jubilees was part of a wider tradition in which heavenly beings served as divine stenographers. These angels didn't bring visions, they brought documentation. And that's where things become just a little too neat. If you wanted to control a population ritually, theologically, politically, what better way than to declare that the original laws were not only sacred, but filed in heaven's central archive? Jubilees doesn't appeal to the heart. It appeals to authority. The book says, in essence, this isn't just how it was. This is how it's supposed to be. Even more curious is the way the angel treats time. There's a specific moment when he says, "Set your heart upon every word which I shall speak to you on this mountain. For I know their rebellion and their stubbornness before I bring them into the land." The angel isn't just giving Moses a history lesson, he's issuing a warning. It's as if the entire point of the narrative is not remembrance, but preemptive correction. The Israelites haven't broken the covenant yet, but the angel already knows they will. And this book is the audit trail. This posture shifts the role of Moses entirely. He's no longer the prophet receiving thunderous commandments carved in stone. He becomes a scribe receiving dictated cosmic memos from a celestial manager. There's a certain irony here. The man who argued with God, shattered the tablets, and confronted Pharaoh is suddenly cast as a heavenly administrative assistant. And yet this recasting isn't accidental. It serves a purpose. By anchoring the entire biblical narrative in a single conversation between Moses and the angel of the presence, Jubilees centralizes the idea that all sacred knowledge is pre-written. Nothing is spontaneous. Nothing is improvised. The patriarchs didn't act on impulse. They followed scripts. Prophecy becomes less about seeing the future and more about recalling what was already recorded. Some scholars interpret this as a backlash against the chaotic, mystical strain of early Judaism. Where other apocalyptic texts emphasize visions, fire, and messianic suspense, Jubilees doubles down on stability. It's not exciting, but that's the point. There's no need to speculate. The truth has already been filed, stamped, and delivered. The angel said so. But others find this deeply unsettling. If divine history is a closed ledger, then free will becomes an illusion. If Moses is merely the transcriptionist, where does human agency fit in? Are we participants in the covenant, or merely actors reciting lines from an eternal script? Jubilees doesn't offer answers. It just keeps the records. Interestingly, the angel never identifies himself by name. He doesn't need to. His authority comes from proximity, not personality. He speaks because he stands in the presence. That silence, that anonymity adds a layer of mystique. He's not here to be known. He's here to be obeyed. And so the Book of Jubilees becomes not just an alternate Genesis, but a cosmic deposition, a legal transcript of humanity's beginning, delivered by the only being who claims to have been there, watching, counting, and preparing the report. When you next read the familiar stories of Adam, of Abraham, of Moses himself, consider that, according to this hidden book, they were not just living. They were fulfilling appointments, timed, filed, witnessed, and written down by an angel who never once blinked. Step into the silence between stars. In the world of Jubilees, that silence isn't empty, it ticks. Quietly, relentlessly, like the hidden workings of a great celestial clock. Time in this forgotten book is not simply a canvas on which events unfold. It is the very scaffold of the sacred. A framework so precise that even the divine appears bound to its rhythm. The text makes this clear from the beginning. Everything happens in sevens. Not just 7 days of creation, but 7 weeks, 7 years, and ultimately 7 cycles of 7 years, 49-year jubilees that define the flow of sacred history. To the authors of Jubilees, this wasn't just poetic. It was structural. The universe was designed according to a rhythm, and deviation from that rhythm was not mere error. It was spiritual vandalism. There's an almost obsessive insistence on dates in the text. Jubilees offers not only what happened, but when. Isaac wasn't just born. He was born in the 3rd week of the 44th Jubilee on the new moon of the 1st month. Noah's death recorded with equal precision. These aren't narrative details. They are coordinates, proof that history itself has a divine geometry. And every major covenant, every sacred act, every patriarch's movement is mapped within this invisible lattice. To grasp the radical nature of this approach, you have to step back from modern assumptions. Today, we mark time for convenience appointments, anniversaries, taxes. But in the ancient world, time was revelation. Calendars were not neutral. They were declarations of who held divine favor. The sun, the moon, the stars, these were not backdrops. They were the gears of heaven. And in Jubilees, the machinery must run on schedule. This leads to one of the book's more quietly scandalous claims, the rejection of the lunar calendar. Jubilees states bluntly that following the moon leads to error, 13 months intercalated days, heresy. Instead, it offers a solar calendar of 364 days, divided into perfect weeks, so that every festival falls on the same day of the week every year forever. Imagine the appeal to a sect like the Essenes, whose very identity was wrapped around purity and separation from the corrupt Jerusalem priesthood. In that worldview, using the wrong calendar wasn't just a mistake. It was a rebellion against heaven's order. The priests in Jerusalem who followed the lunar reckoning were not just misguided. They were desecrating time itself, and by extension, desecrating the temple. Here's where the architectural metaphor becomes eerily literal. Jubilees doesn't describe sacred time as an idea. It describes it as a building, a structure made of weeks and jubilees with gates, thresholds, and appointments. The year is a temple. The festivals are its furnishings. You don't just celebrate Passover, you enter a specific chamber of time already constructed by God. Miss the date and you're not just late, you're standing outside the house. This mindset echoes an ancient tension that stretched across the Second Temple period. Competing sects in Judaism, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, all argued not just about doctrine, but about time. Who counted it correctly? Who kept the festivals at the right hour? And behind those arguments lurked something deeper. If sacred acts must happen on sacred days, then whoever controls the calendar controls access to God. It's easy to miss how political this becomes. If the priests in Jerusalem were setting the dates based on a flawed system, then every sacrifice, every festival, every day of atonement was off by a margin, not just of hours, but of cosmic alignment. Jubilees isn't coy about this. It accuses the temple leadership implicitly, if not directly, of corrupting sacred time. One of the lesser-known scrolls found at Qumran includes a calendar that matches the system used in Jubilees, right down to the seasonal markers and feast days. This suggests a shared lineage, one that valued order over adaptation, permanence over practicality. Where most traditions adjusted the calendar to match the moon and harvests, this one would rather be out of sync with the world than out of sync with the stars. And yet, for all its rigidity, there's a strange comfort in Jubilees' vision of time. In a chaotic world where exile, empire, and betrayal were daily fears, the idea of a hidden schedule ticking in the background must have offered a kind of peace. Nothing is random. Every injustice, every delay, every silence has its appointed time. Even the end of days is not a surprise, it's an entry in the ledger waiting for the hour to come due. Of course, this raises unsettling questions. If everything is measured, then is anything spontaneous? If Abraham was destined to bind Isaac, if Jacob was timed to dream at Bethel, if the Exodus was penciled in long before Pharaoh ever drew breath, what room is left for free will Jubilees doesn't resolve this tension. It simply carries on counting. You may be tempted to dismiss this calendar obsession as ancient superstition. But remember, our own faith systems still hinge on dates. Easter shifts based on the moon. Ramadan follows a lunar rhythm. The Sabbath arrives not when we need it, but when it is summoned. Time, even now, is not fully ours. In the end, Jubilees offers a vision of reality, where God is not just creator but architect of time, where angels do not merely sing, they schedule, and where holiness is not found in mystery but in math. It may not be comforting, but it is precise. You think you know the story: a garden, a tree, a serpent. Two humans plucked from dust and rib, placed in paradise with one rule: do not eat from the tree of knowledge. The woman is deceived. The man follows. The fall begins. It's been told in paintings and pulpits for centuries, heavy with guilt and shame and the weight of original sin. But in the Book of Jubilees, that story takes a quieter, stranger turn. In this version, the garden is still lush, still holy, but more procedural. Adam is not merely created, he is created at a specific time on the 6th day of the first week of the second Jubilee. Jubilees doesn't rely on poetic ambiguity. It timestamps the origin of humanity with bureaucratic reverence. Eve is formed shortly after, not from Adam's rib in the dramatic fashion you might expect, but more like a divinely scheduled appointment, an entry in the cosmic ledger. And then comes the fall. But here the serpent is not the smooth-talking tempter of Genesis. Jubilees leaves him mostly unnamed, barely described. Instead, the spotlight shifts. The true blame, as subtly implied, rests not on a talking snake, but on a deeper cosmic flaw, the presence of knowledge given too soon. The act itself is curiously downplayed. Jubilees does not revel in the seduction of sin or the shame of nakedness. What it emphasizes instead is the timing. Adam and Eve ate from the tree in the 4th month on the 17th day, a Tuesday, essentially. The book insists on anchoring even sin to the calendar. That's the unsettling twist. Even the fall had a date. It wasn't spontaneous, it was foretold. This is where the Watchers begin to flicker in the background. The Watchers, those mysterious angels introduced more fully later in the narrative, are alluded to as early presences. Their knowledge, their desire to interfere, their impatience with divine order, these begin to cast a long shadow over the Aiden story. If the forbidden knowledge came from the tree, what sort of beings longed to share it? And why did it matter when that knowledge was accessed? Some scholars see in Jubilees a quiet shifting of theological blame. The sin of humanity is not one of defiance but of poor timing. Eve is not framed as an evil temptress, nor is Adam a coward. Instead, they are early acting before the scheduled moment. Had they waited, perhaps they would have received knowledge as a gift rather than stolen it as a crime. Sin in this framework is not transgression, it is premature access. This interpretation radically reframes the moral logic of Eden. It suggests that humanity's downfall was not rooted in desire, but in disorder. And that idea runs like a pulse through the rest of Jubilees. Time is sacred. Deviating from the appointed hour, even for something as noble as knowledge, has cosmic consequences. Interestingly, Jubilees introduces the concept of repentance and forgiveness far earlier than Genesis does. After the fall, Adam and Eve are not cast out in wrath. Instead, they are given garments and allowed to dwell near the entrance of the garden. There they begin to fast, to mourn, to learn. Their exile is not so much a punishment as a reset. Humanity is not banished for being evil, but for being out of sync. And in a fascinating detail omitted in many retellings, Jubilees claims that Adam wrote a testament, a written record of his life, his fall, and the promise of redemption to come. It's a fleeting mention almost easy to miss, but it implies something profound, that the first human being was not just a tiller of soil or a fallen prince. He was a chronicler, a witness to the earliest breach in sacred order and the first to try and record the way back. This quiet act of documentation echoes the structure of Jubilees itself. Just as the angel of the presence records and explains history to Moses, so too did Adam attempt to preserve the truth of his own failure, not in myth, but in writing. Which invites a provocative question: how many sacred texts were never canonized? Not because they were false, but because they were too honest, too linear, too bound to time. The echo of this reimagined fall can be felt throughout history. You might remember that in the early Christian Gnostic tradition, the serpent is not a villain at all. In some versions, it's even a liberator, an agent of enlightenment. Jubilees doesn't go that far, but it does place the fall in a framework that challenges traditional orthodoxy. Sin is not about disobedience alone. It's about breaking the pattern. And that makes redemption not a matter of belief, but of restoration. If all things are meant to occur in their appointed seasons, then the fall of man becomes a delay in the great unfolding. And every covenant, every law, every festival that follows is an attempt to realign humanity with the original rhythm. The Sabbath, the Jubilees, the feasts, they're not just rituals, they're reminders, clocks in disguise. So when you next hear the Eden story, told as a cautionary tale of pride, imagine instead a quiet ticking in the background, a missed beat, a dance step out of time, and two humans who reached too early for something that might have been given freely, if only they'd waited one more season. Sin, as Jubilees sees it, is not in the reach, it is in the timing. By now the silence is starting to sound crowded. The Book of Jubilees, so meticulous in counting days and measuring covenants, begins to lift the veil on the characters who operate not in the light of day, but behind the scenery of the sacred calendar. They are the Watchers, celestial beings, who were supposed to keep watch over humanity. What they did instead was fall. The bones of this tale lie buried in Genesis 6 in a verse so cryptic it could be mistaken for a footnote. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. That single line has sparked centuries of speculation. Jubilees takes that fragment and expands it into an entire sub-narrative, one filled with rebellion, seduction, unnatural offspring, and consequences that flood the earth, literally. According to Jubilees, it wasn't humanity that first brought chaos to creation. It was the angels. These watchers descended to earth in the days of Jared, a patriarch, whose name means descent, as if he were born for this very moment of celestial interference. The angels took human wives, fathered giants, and taught forbidden knowledge, sorcery, war, cosmetics, astrology. You know, all the usual ways to mess up a civilization, but the real tragedy isn't the teaching, it's the timing. The Watchers acted outside the appointed order. They broke rank. They inserted themselves into a story that had not been written for them. And in doing so, they didn't just corrupt humanity, they corrupted time itself. The giants or Nephilim were not simply large, they were unstable. Their existence disrupted the cycles of the earth. Their appetites, we're told, consumed not just food, but blood. Their violence spread like a virus through generations. They were not meant to be, and their presence threw the divine calendar into chaos. Jubilees traces the escalation with methodical precision. The book doesn't sensationalize the giants. It audits them, lists their lineage, their deeds, and the exact moment when heaven decided enough was enough. The flood, it turns out, wasn't just about cleansing human sin. It was about resetting the pattern. A cosmic correction to restore the symmetry of time. And here's where things get especially uncomfortable. The angels who fell weren't forgotten. Jubilees records their punishment in chilling detail. They are bound, cast into the depths of the earth, sealed in darkness until the day of judgment. It's not poetic justice. It's legal containment. They are filed away like corrupted lines of code in a divine operating system, isolated to preserve the function of the whole. One of the more obscure but fascinating scholarly debates centers around the identity of these watchers. Some traditions identify them as the same beings mentioned in the Book of Enoch, another apocryphal text that was beloved at Qumran but banned by later authorities. Enoch goes further than Jubilees, naming the Watchers, describing their crimes, and even assigning blame for specific human technologies. Jubilees is more restrained, but the connection is there, unmistakable. A parallel canon echoing just beyond the edge of orthodoxy. Why does this matter? Because Jubilees ties the rebellion of the Watchers to the root of all human corruption. It isn't Eve's hunger or Cain's jealousy that dooms the world. It's the moment divine beings abandon their posts and interrupt the sacred schedule. Sin again is portrayed not just as disobedience, but as distortion. There's also a subtle callback to the fall of Adam and Eve. Just as they grasped at knowledge too soon, so too did the Watchers seek union and wisdom beyond their assigned domain. In both cases, the disruption of divine timing leads to catastrophe. And in both cases, the only way forward is a reset, a flood, a washing away of what should not have been. But this narrative thread leaves a strange aftertaste. If angels can fall, if they can love, teach, and corrupt, then what are they really? Guardians, bureaucrats, or beings not so different from us, bound by time, but with further to fall? Jubilees offers no comfort here. It presents the story not as warning, but as record. The damage was done, the punishment delivered, the cycle restarted. Yet something lingers. The idea that even now the Watchers remain bound beneath the earth, waiting, not for forgiveness, but for judgment. That under the surface of history, beneath the soil and stone and sacrament, there are still echoes of that original rebellion. Some readers of Jubilees, particularly within the Ethiopian tradition, believe that the sins of the Watchers explain the persistence of evil, that the structures of sin we see today, violence, injustice, chaos, are not just human, they are echoes, inherited distortions, the long shadow of a choice made before we were ever born. And if that's true, then the book's obsession with timing isn't about control. It's about defense. A way to hold back the chaos to reassert the rhythm that the Watchers tried to shatter. The giants may be gone, but their legacy remains. You don't need to believe in fallen angels to see the weight of what this story implies. It's not about wings or swords or supernatural romances. It's about what happens when even the Watchers lose the plot. And it asks gently but insistently, who's keeping time now? You've heard it told as a children's story, Noah the Ark. The animals in pairs the rainbow after the storm. A tale of obedience and survival sealed with soft watercolor illustrations and smiling giraffes. But in the Book of Jubilees, the flood is no bedtime story. It is a forensic report. A deliberate intervention in a timeline that had spun wildly out of control. Jubilees presents the flood not as a punishment in the classic sense, but as a reset, God's divine reboot. The corruption of humanity, fueled by the sins of the Watchers and the violence of their hybrid offspring, had compromised the calendar itself. The very structure of time that sacred architecture so carefully measured in sevens had been fractured. The world wasn't just sinful, it was off schedule, and when time breaks, so does everything else. According to Jubilees, Noah wasn't chosen simply because he was righteous. He was chosen because he remembered. He honored the appointed feasts. He lived in accordance with the calendar passed down from his ancestors, preserved through Seth, Enosh, and Enoch. Where others followed chaos, Noah followed the ticking of heaven's clock. That distinction matters. He wasn't just a good man, he was a punctual one. The timeline is laid out with unnerving clarity. The deluge begins in the 27th Jubilee in the second month on the 17th day, exactly the same date, we're told, that Adam first entered the garden. That's not a coincidence. It's a cycle. Creation begins on that date, and now it ends. Or more accurately, it resets. This fixation on time doesn't let up. Even the construction of the ark follows a strict chronology. Jubilees tells us Noah took exactly 5 years to build it. Not 6, not 4, 5. As if God had penciled it in on some divine planner, flood prep 5 years. Launch week 2, month 2. But the most startling deviation from the Genesis account is what comes after the rain stops. In Jubilees, the post-flood world is not simply cleansed, it is recalibrated. Noah doesn't just offer a sacrifice. He receives a covenantal download. He is given a scroll. A document that records the heavenly calendar, the laws of purity, and the appointed feasts, along with instructions to pass it on to his children and their children after them. This moment changes Noah's role. He's no longer just a survivor. He becomes the steward of sacred time. The first to receive, preserve, and transmit what will later be called the law. According to Jubilees, the covenant begins not with Moses, but here with Noah. The post-flood world is not a blank slate. It is a re-anchored timeline with Noah as its first archivist. That claim ruffles more than a few theological feathers. If the law predates Sinai, if the feast days and purity codes were already revealed to Noah, then Moses isn't the beginning of covenantal law. He's the reissue, the second edition, and suddenly, the narrative arc of the Bible shifts dramatically. Jubilees rewires the history of divine-human relations, placing the burden of obedience not on a chosen nation, but on the descendants of a single man who survived a flood by keeping time correctly. This vision also redefines the rainbow. In Genesis, the rainbow is a symbol of peace, a promise that God will never again destroy the earth with water. In Jubilees, the rainbow still appears, but as part of a larger system of celestial signs tied to the order of the seasons and the return of the calendar. It's not just a symbol, it's a reminder to stay on schedule, and the tension returns. If history is a cycle, not a linear march, then the flood isn't a one-time event. It's a precedent, a template, a warning. When time is broken, correction follows. It may not come with rain, but it will come. That quiet threat lingers at the edge of every page. This is where Jubilees leans apocalyptic, not with visions of dragons or horsemen, but with the relentless idea that history repeats itself when ignored. The flood is less about water and more about deviation. Step too far from the appointed times, and the world begins to unravel. One obscure but compelling debate among scholars touches on the Book of Division mentioned in Jubilees. This mysterious document is said to contain all the appointed times of heaven broken into Jubilees and weeks. Some suggest it's a lost scroll referenced only in this text. Others believe it's metaphorical, a reference to the very structure of Jubilees itself. But either way, it frames history not as story, but as schedule. And in this framework, the flood sits like a dividing line. Before it, corruption, disorder, fallen angels, and untimed chaos. After it, law, clarity, and a chance to start the clock again. But only if the scroll is followed. Only if the covenant of time is kept. This raises a thorny question. One scholars still argue about, was the flood meant to erase or to preserve? Genesis emphasizes the cleansing, the washing away. Jubilees emphasizes the inheritance, the passing down of the calendar, the restoration of divine rhythm. It doesn't say, start over. It says, do it right this time. And who among us hasn't needed that? A restart, not because everything was lost, but because somewhere we stepped out of time, lost the rhythm, forgot the beat. Noah's Ark was more than a vessel. It was a clock, floating above the drowned world, ticking softly through the rain. Imagine surviving the end of the world, stepping off the ark into a silence so vast it swallows thought. The wind has stopped. The sky is pale. Everything you once knew is gone, cities, temples, people all washed away in a divine tide. And now you, Noah, stand blinking beneath the sun, not as a man, but as the sole witness to the earth's first death. In most traditions, this is where the story ends. A rainbow appears. God speaks. Humanity begins again. But in the Book of Jubilees, the flood is only the midpoint. What comes next is more revelatory and far more unsettling. Jubilees tells us that Noah, after the waters receded and the covenant was renewed, wrote a testament. A document passed to his sons detailing not only the events of the flood, but visions of the future. Instructions, warnings, judgments. He becomes not just a patriarch, but a prophet, a lawgiver, and his testament, though largely lost to time, flickers briefly in the shadows of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the traditions of the Ethiopian Church. It's a moment easily missed. Most readers focus on the drama of the Ark or the aftermath of Ham's curse, but Jubilees slows the narrative down and places the quill in Noah's hand. He writes of unclean spirits, of the rise of future empires, and of a coming judgment far worse than the flood. He warns of a time when the appointed festivals will be forgotten, when the sacred calendar will be corrupted, and when humanity will once again provoke heaven by distorting time. He names his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth not merely as progenitors of nations, but as stewards of divine knowledge. He assigns each a portion of the earth, and more controversially, a portion of heaven's expectations. This is where Jubilees becomes quietly radical. The land isn't just geography, it's a map of covenantal responsibility. Each son must guard what was given, including the laws, the feasts, and the memory of how time once worked. But not all of them will. Noah predicts division. He foresees that one lineage will forget, the appointed times will follow, idols will abandon the festivals of light. The implications are sharp. Jubilees seems to imply that the descendants of Ham in particular will stray. This has been abused historically, twisted into racist ideologies that the text itself doesn't justify. But the heart of Noah's warning lies not in bloodline, but in memory. Forgetting is the first sin. Once time is no longer kept, everything else follows. And the spirits. Ah, yes, the unclean spirits. Jubilees tells us that when the giants, the offspring of the Watchers, were killed in the flood, their souls remained. Disembodied, restless, not fully angel, not fully human. They linger as malevolent forces, whisperers of sin and distortion. Noah pleads with God to remove them from the earth, to bind them like their fathers. God agrees mostly. 90% are banished, but 10% are allowed to remain under the authority of one of Noah's descendants to test and trouble humanity until the final judgment. This small, often overlooked detail has echoed through esoteric traditions for centuries. The idea that some evils are not accidents, but permitted. That temptation itself is part of the plan. Not as cruelty, but as proof of choice. In the theology of Jubilees, this becomes a subtle but powerful undercurrent. The world was reset, but not perfected. Testing will continue. Records will be kept. And at the appointed time, judgment will fall, not with water, but with fire. Noah's testament is not preserved in full. It vanishes from most versions of the Bible, living only in hints in Jubilees, in fragments attributed to the Book of Noah, and in second-hand echoes from early Christian and Jewish mystics. But its presence shapes the rest of the narrative. The reader understands everything that follows. The call of Abraham, the rise of Israel, the giving of the law is not a new plan. It's the continuation of a covenant already delivered, already written. Moses receives the law at Sinai, but according to Jubilees, he's just receiving the updated terms. The first version came after the flood, when Noah stood in the silence and looked backward through destruction and forward into destiny. That idea that law can precede nationhood, that time can be sacred before temples exist, flips much of biblical tradition on its head, and yet it fits perfectly into the structure of Jubilees. Of course Noah would write. Of course he would count. He lived in a world rebuilt by order, a world timed by God, a world where the flood was not an end, but a recalibration. He had seen what happened when angels interfered. He had watched time itself collapse. He understood better than anyone the stakes of forgetting. The testament of Noah then becomes more than a lost scroll. It is the philosophical spine of the book. The idea that knowledge must be preserved, that history must be recorded, that the rhythm of time must be honored, or else face the floodwaters again. And so in the shadows of the ark, before the nations were born, a man who survived the end of the world wrote down how not to end it again. You won't find his words in your standard Bible. But somewhere perhaps buried in Qumran dust, or bound in the pages of Ge'ez manuscripts, the first covenant still whispers. Not in thunder, but in dates. He's often remembered as the father of faith, a lone figure under the stars, hearing the voice of God, leaving everything behind for a promise he couldn't see. Abraham's story, as told in the Book of Genesis, is sweeping and emotional belief against all odds, devotion without proof. But in the Book of Jubilees, that image is fine, but incomplete. Here, Abraham is not just a man of faith, he's a man of law, of dates, of rituals performed not because they felt right, but because they were precisely scheduled. In Jubilees, his life unfolds like a divinely structured ledger, covenants stamped with timestamps, blessings benchmarked by weeks tests, arriving exactly when they were foretold. Abraham's birth is dated to the beginning of the 3rd week of the 42nd Jubilee. His call from God, the moment that begins the great journey, is also anchored to a specific year, month, and day. This isn't just a biographical sketch, it's an audit trail. You could almost imagine a celestial clerk noting each event with a solemn nod. And yet, it doesn't make him cold. In fact, Jubilees portrays Abraham as deeply emotional, painfully aware of the stakes, and constantly engaged in acts of intercession. But everything he does in alignment with the heavenly calendar. He fasts at the appointed time. He celebrates feasts that, according to most canonical accounts, hadn't even been established yet. This is where the text becomes quietly radical. Jubilees insists that Abraham observed the laws of the Torah centuries before Moses received them. He kept the festival of weeks. He circumcised his household on the exact day prescribed by the law. He offered sacrifices not at random, but on precise feast days. The implication is sharp. The law is not Mosaic. It is eternal, embedded in the fabric of time itself. This turns Abraham into something far more complex. He's not just the origin of a bloodline. He's the prototype of covenantal obedience. Jubilees reframes him as the model not only of belief, but of correct liturgical behavior. God doesn't just test his heart, he tests his punctuality. The theological implications of this are enormous. If Abraham followed the law, then the later giving of that law at Sinai wasn't a new revelation, it was a restoration. A reminder, an alignment. Moses doesn't deliver something fresh. He reactivates what Abraham already knew. And in doing so, Jubilees pulls the rug out from under centuries of canonical sequencing. One moment in particular stands out: the covenant of circumcision. In Genesis, this act is introduced as a symbolic gesture, an outward sign of an inward promise. In Jubilees, it is precisely scheduled. Abraham is commanded to perform it on the exact 8th day, no more, no less. He complies. He doesn't delay. This is not framed as a mere ritual. It is an act of temporal alignment. The body marked at the appointed moment becomes a sign not just of belonging, but of being in sync with heaven. Abraham's interactions with other figures are similarly timed. His journeys, his conflicts, his visitations by angels, each one is slotted into a date and week, as if the heavens themselves were running a sacred itinerary. You start to see the pattern. Events in Jubilees don't just happen. They arrive when summoned. There's a particularly obscure tradition mentioned in the book Abraham teaches, writing to his sons. He instructs them to record events, to keep dates, to honor the passage of time, not only with memory, but with notation. This detail, almost invisible in most tellings, suggests that Abraham wasn't just a shepherd or nomad. He was a teacher of sacred record-keeping. The calendar wasn't a backdrop to his story. It was the story. But not everyone receives his legacy equally. Jubilees makes a point of recording Abraham's blessings and warnings to Ishmael and the sons of Keturah. The theme is clear: those who forget the appointed times, who abandon the calendar of heaven, will fall into idolatry, into lawlessness. The covenant is not about DNA, it's about memory, and more specifically, remembered obedience. A debate simmers here in scholarly circles. Some argue that Jubilees uses Abraham to retroactively justify the legalism of the Essenes, that by casting him as the original lawkeeper, the authors could validate their own obsession with purity and calendrical precision. But others suggest something more subtle, a longing to restore coherence. In a world fractured by exile, war, and religious fragmentation, Abraham's ordered life became a symbol of cosmic continuity. There's a callback here to Noah's testament. Just as Noah recorded the sacred festivals, so too does Abraham revive them. The same feasts, the same weeks, a pulse passed from one generation to the next, attempting to keep history in sync with its divine architect. But even Abraham falters briefly. Jubilees recounts the moment when he hesitates, when famine drives him to Egypt without explicit instruction from God. The text doesn't linger on it, but the deviation is noted. The lesson is quiet but clear. Even the righteous can step out of sync, and when they do, consequences ripple through the covenant. Still, he returns, reorients, builds altars, teaches his sons, and when the time comes to bless Isaac, Abraham passes not just his wealth or his land, but his schedule, his awareness that every promise hinges on being in the right place at the right time. It's a different Abraham than the one most people know, less mystical, more methodical, but in some ways more human. A man trying to live not just with faith, but with rhythm. And in doing so, he doesn't just become the father of nations. He becomes the metronome of sacred history. You already know the outline. Abraham leads his son Isaac up a mountain, builds an altar, ties the boy down, and raises the knife. At the last second, an angel intervenes. A ram appears. Everyone breathes again. It's the story of faith tested and rewarded, of a man willing to give up what he loved most to prove his devotion. But in the Book of Jubilees, that iconic scene is peeled back, restructured, and reloaded with ritual. This isn't just a story of obedience, it's a celestial appointment, timed, measured, and executed with unnerving precision. First, there's the date. Of course there is. Jubilees tells us that the binding of Isaac, known in Jewish tradition as the Akedah, occurred during a specific week on a specific day in a specific year. The sacrifice was not spontaneous, it was scheduled. That may sound cold, even mechanical, but in the logic of Jubilees, it's the highest form of reverence. Sacred acts happen not because the heart is stirred, but because the hour has come. And that hour, it seems, was cosmically significant. According to the text, the attempted sacrifice of Isaac was not merely a test of Abraham's loyalty. It was a divine signal, an anchor point in the Jubilee cycle echoed in later generations, through feast days and temple rituals. The mountain where it occurred was not just a random peak. It would later become the site of the temple in Jerusalem. The act was not private, it was archetypal. But here's where Jubilees diverges from the emotional framing you may be used to. It downplays the terror. There is no trembling hand, no tearful goodbye. Abraham prepares calmly. Isaac complies willingly. It reads less like a crisis of conscience and more like the fulfillment of an obligation long understood. And that changes the whole atmosphere. Because in this version, Isaac is not a victim, he's a participant. Jubilees paints him as informed and unafraid, asking his father to bind him securely so that the offering will be perfect. He's not being tricked, he's cooperating. The narrative flips from trauma to ritual, a solemn ceremony, not a failed execution. Some scholars see this as an effort to preserve Abraham's legacy. Others believe it elevates Isaac as a precursor to later sacrificial motifs, especially within temple traditions. But what matters in the logic of Jubilees is that nothing here is chaotic. Even the ram appears on schedule. The angel doesn't arrive in panic. He arrives on cue, and afterward, there is no sense of relief, only affirmation. The angel declares that Abraham's action has ratified the covenant forever, a formal seal, an official entry in the divine record. It is as though the entire test existed not for Abraham's sake, but for the heavenly scribes. The moment had to be logged. Time had to be punctuated by obedience. There's an echo here of Noah's post-flood covenant. Just as Noah was given commandments, Abraham is rewarded with reaffirmation. His descendants will inherit the land. They will rule many nations. And again, the reward is tied to timing. Jubilees makes it clear that this covenant has a built-in cycle. If the children of Abraham obey the appointed times, the blessings will flow. If they forget, well, we've seen how that goes. The Akedah becomes a model not of faith alone, but of synchronized devotion. Abraham acts because he knows when to act. Isaac follows because he trusts in that timing. And the whole episode becomes a template echoed later in Passover, in temple offerings, in the rhythms of religious life. The test becomes the timer. But the story doesn't end there. Jubilees tells us something you won't find in Genesis. After the event, Abraham returns and dwells in peace. But he also begins to teach more fervently. He builds altars, establishes feast days, and writes down his understanding of God's laws. The near sacrifice sharpens his clarity. He understands now that every major act must be timed precisely. It's not enough to believe. You must align. And Isaac. His role continues to echo. Jubilees insists that he too observed the appointed feasts, that he kept the Sabbath, that he followed his father's calendar. This continuity matters deeply to the narrative. If Abraham were faithful but Isaac careless, the covenant would wobble. But in this telling, they walk in step. Father and son, day and hour, altar and ram. One obscure interpretation debated quietly among scholars suggests that the Akedah in Jubilees serves a dual purpose, both as a test and as a cosmic rehearsal. That in some distant future, another sacrifice would echo this one. A willing son, a mountaintop, a knife raised, but this time no angel would stop it. Jubilees doesn't say this directly, but the rhythm is there. And here a subtle callback emerges: Eve and Adam reaching for knowledge too soon. The watchers sharing wisdom before it was appointed. Noah resetting the calendar. Abraham and Isaac finally aligned. The difference isn't obedience, it's timing. The Akedah is not proof of Abraham's heart. It's proof of his precision. He acted at the right moment. And so the covenant, once fractured, is finally in tune again. You might find this cold. The emotional weight of the Genesis version, the suspense, the trembling, is replaced by clockwork certainty. But that's precisely what makes Jubilees so distinct. It's not a book of feelings. It's a book of alignment. When every step is in order, the divine flows freely. When even the knife is on schedule, mercy knows exactly when to arrive. So next time you hear the story, told as a moment of blind faith, remember, in Jubilees, it was anything but blind. It was right on time. They were never just messengers. In the pages of Jubilees, angels aren't fleeting sparks of divine drama, they are embedded, assigned, constant. From the creation of the world to the trials of Abraham and the dreams of Jacob, these beings are not guests in the story. They are administrators of it. Most readers of Genesis encounter angels as surprises, unexpected figures who arrive to warn Lot, wrestle Jacob, or deliver cryptic announcements. They're dramatic, yes, but occasional. Jubilees gives them a promotion. Here they are, permanent fixtures in the narrative, woven into the events of each generation, like divine chaperones. They are not only involved in heavenly things, they supervise human ones. This begins early. Before Adam is even formed, angels are already present, sanctified, ranked, and tasked. By the time Abraham walks, the earth's entire departments of angels are in operation. There's the angel of the presence who narrates the book itself, and the angel of sanctification, responsible for blessings, covenants, and the rhythms of sacred time. There are guardian angels, punitive angels, recording angels. It's not a hierarchy of fire and trumpets, it's more like a divine civil service. Abraham doesn't just hear God's voice in the wilderness. According to Jubilees, he speaks with angels regularly. They instruct him on the laws of purity. They explain the feast days. They warn him of danger and reaffirm his covenant. Their tone is not ecstatic. It's almost managerial. Abraham is not stunned by their presence. He receives them as one might receive a visiting inspector, respectfully, but not with terror. This tone carries forward. Isaac, too, is guided by angels, not merely protected, but corrected. When famine threatens, an angel tells him not to flee to Egypt, but to remain in the land and trust the covenant. Jacob's visions, those famous dreams of ladders and wrestling, are more than symbolic in Jubilees. They are briefings. The ladder isn't just an image of heaven, it is a route. The wrestling is not a metaphor, it is training. And again, everything happens at the appointed time. Jubilees tracks these encounters with precise dates. The patriarchs don't stumble into divine moments. They are scheduled for them. And the angels, faithful to their assignments, never miss a meeting. One of the more obscure but telling passages comes when Jacob blesses his sons. In Genesis, the scene is deeply human, a father speaking from his heart, offering predictions and hopes. In Jubilees, Jacob is portrayed as a vessel of revelation guided by the angel of the presence. His words are not his own. They are dictated, transmitted. This notion unsettles some modern readers. It strips away spontaneity, making the patriarchs feel more like characters in a heavenly script than individuals forging their own destinies. But for the authors of Jubilees, and likely the Qumran community who treasured it, this was comforting, not constraining. The idea that angels were always nearby meant that the story could not be derailed. Even human error would not lead to chaos. The watchers were watching. The counters were counting. This continuity links back to the earlier appearance of angels in creation itself. Just as the cosmos began with divine supervision, so too does the covenant continue under that same watchful presence. The angels don't vanish once the world is made. They adapt. They guide the patriarchs through famine, war, migration, and betrayal. They don't intervene with dramatic miracles. They instruct quietly, insistently, and always on time. But the most fascinating implication of this ever-present angelic oversight is what it says about Scripture itself. If angels are narrating, directing, and recording the story, then the patriarchs are not simply living history, they are participating in a documented process. Jubilees itself becomes part of that documentation, a record not just of events, but of divine administration. Some scholars have suggested that this angelic framework reflects the worldview of the Essenes, the sect thought to have written and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their obsession with purity law and celestial order mirrors the roles these angels play. To them, divine presence wasn't spontaneous. It was institutional. It followed protocol. And angels were the enforcers of that sacred bureaucracy. There's even a soft callback to the fall of the Watchers. Remember those early angels who overstepped, who shared forbidden knowledge and disrupted the timeline. The angels of Jubilees seem designed in response. These are not rebels. They are loyalists, professional, bound to the rhythm of heaven, they restore what the Watchers fractured. This makes the world of Jubilees feel different than the world of Genesis, less mythic, more structured. The patriarchs are still flawed, still human, but they are never alone. Every prayer, every decision, every journey unfolds beneath the eyes of a celestial order that remembers everything. And you listening now might wonder if the angels never stopped watching. Where are they now? Has their silence meant absence? Or simply that their work continues unnoticed? Jubilees doesn't answer that. It doesn't have to. Its quiet assertion is that the world has always been under supervision, that long after the patriarchs faded, the scrolls remained. The angels filed their reports, and the rhythms of sacred time continue unseen but unbroken. So the next time you imagine the great figures of biblical history wandering alone in deserts and dreams, remember they were never alone. Someone was always keeping the record. It's the thunder on the mountain that most people remember. Fire smoke, trembling earth, Moses climbing into the clouds to receive the law etched by the very finger of God. Sinai stands as the singular moment when divine command met human civilization, when a wandering people became a nation under covenant. But what if it wasn't the beginning? What if that moment was not a first, but a return in the Book of Jubilees? Sinai is not a debut, it is déjà vu. Jubilees makes a bold claim, one that rewires the entire structure of biblical theology. The law, the commandments, the feasts, the purity codes, was not new. It was old, ancient, older than Moses, older even than Abraham. It was written in heaven from the beginning, woven into creation itself, and passed down through those who remembered. According to Jubilees, the patriarchs Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham observed the commandments long before Sinai's thunder. They celebrated festivals, avoided unclean animals, and observed Sabbath, not as symbolic acts, but as covenantal duties. These weren't glimpses of future law, they were the law. And their obedience wasn't cultural, it was calendrical. Everything happened according to sacred timing. This is not a casual suggestion. It's the theological engine of the entire book. Jubilees insists that the law was given to the angels at creation and shared with the righteous throughout history. Sinai, then, is not about revealing something new. It's about restoring what had been forgotten, corrupted, or suppressed. The implications are massive. It means Moses didn't ascend the mountain to receive a revelation, he went to receive the record. The same laws kept by Enoch when he walked with God. The same feast days honored by Abraham. The same purity codes known to Noah as he sorted the clean from the unclean on the ark. This divine continuity reframes the role of Israel. Instead of being chosen to begin the covenant, they were chosen to continue it. Sinai is no longer a historical eruption. It is an act of divine memory, a return to a rhythm already in place. The Book of Jubilees reinforces this with an almost compulsive emphasis on precision. It repeatedly notes when each patriarch kept the feasts, observed Sabbaths, or offered sacrifices. Abraham is said to have kept the Feast of Weeks, also known as Shavuot, long before it was given a name. Jacob tithed and followed dietary laws while still in the household of Laban. These aren't retcons, they're restorations. Jubilees is telling you gently but firmly that if you've been waiting for the law to arrive in Exodus 20, you've come late to the party. This vision places law at the center of cosmic order, not as a burden, but as a stabilizer. Just as the sun rises and sets, just as the weeks cycle into jubilees, so too must human behavior follow a sacred pattern. When people act out of sync with that pattern, when they forget the law or follow the wrong calendar, the world begins to tilt. And when they return to the law, They realign with the architecture of creation itself. One of the more obscure yet telling moments in Jubilees is when it describes the heavenly tablets. These divine records kept by the angel of the presence are said to contain the laws, the history of humanity, and the appointed times. They are not dynamic. They do not change. History, according to Jubilees, is not improvisation, it is adherence. This opens a quiet but significant debate. If the law is eternal, then what role do prophets play? What about kings, priests? Are they innovators or merely custodians? Jubilees leans hard toward the latter. The most righteous figures in the story are those who preserve the pattern, not those who create new ones. Enoch, who never dies, is praised not for insight, but for obedience. Abraham, the covenant-bearer, succeeds not because he believes, but because he remembers. There's also a callback here to the flood. Noah is spared not just for his righteousness, but for his precision. He walks in the ways of the Lord, which Jubilees defines as adherence to the law long before Moses was even born. This continuity extends to Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, drawing an unbroken line of lawkeepers stretching from Eden to Egypt. But Jubilees does not ignore the fractures. It acknowledges that after Jacob's death, the descendants of Israel faltered. They forgot the law. They adopted the customs of Egypt. They drifted from the appointed times. Sinai then becomes an emergency response, a reset. The people must be brought back into alignment. Moses doesn't teach them something new. He reminds them of what their ancestors already knew. Some scholars read this as a direct challenge to the theology of Paul, who emphasized that the law was temporary, fulfilled in faith. Jubilees says otherwise. For its authors, the law is not temporary, it is timeless. It existed before humanity and will outlast history. Faith matters, but timing matters more. It's worth noting that this view echoes a broader tradition in Second Temple Judaism. Several sects believed the law was written on heavenly tablets. That idea isn't unique to Jubilees, but nowhere is it stated so directly, so relentlessly. And it adds a strange weight to the world around us. If the law is embedded in creation, then every breeze, every season, every sunrise becomes a reminder. Not of moralism, but of rhythm. The world itself keeps time, and you are invited or perhaps commanded to keep time with it. So when Moses climbs Sinai in the storm, he is not opening a new chapter. He is retrieving an old scroll, dusting off a forgotten calendar, listening perhaps to the faint ticking of a clock that began long before Egypt, long before Abraham, maybe even long before Eden. And somewhere high above or deep within, the angels are still recording. If Jubilees had a favorite topic besides angels' obedience and the occasional cosmic flood, it would be feasts. Not feasts as we know them with tables and toasts, but feasts as sacred anchor points in the divine structure of time. In the world of Jubilees, festivals aren't just celebrations. They're cosmic appointments designed before creation and meant to be kept forever. Which is why the calendar, how and when these feasts are observed, is not a detail. It's the battlefront. You might think a calendar is a neutral thing, a tool, a convenience. But in ancient Israel, it was anything but. A calendar determined when sacrifices were offered, when fields were harvested, when the year began and ended. It structured work, worship, memory, and identity. And crucially, it determined when the people met with God. In that sense, whoever controlled the calendar didn't just control time, they controlled covenant. In the mainstream Jewish tradition, time was shaped by the moon. Months were marked by its waxing and waning. Festivals floated. Some years had 12 months, some 13, depending on agricultural needs and lunar cycles. This fluidity allowed the system to adapt. It also introduced complexity, intercalation adjustments, debates over dates. But for the writers of Jubilees, this flexibility wasn't a virtue. It was a corruption. Jubilees insists on a 364-day solar calendar. Not 365, not lunar, not adjustable. A perfect number, 52 weeks, 4 seasons, and every festival landing on the same day of the week, year after year, world without end. According to the text, this calendar was revealed to Enoch, kept by Noah, observed by Abraham, and taught by angels. It wasn't invented. It was inherited. And the consequences of ignoring it, severe. Jubilees declares that those who follow the moon will go astray. They will miss the appointed times. They will defile the feasts. The covenant will fracture. And worst of all, they won't even know it. It's a quiet but devastating critique of the official priestly calendar in Jerusalem. The implication is clear: the temple authorities, those charged with guarding the covenant, have lost the clock. This isn't just a theoretical complaint. The Qumran community, who preserved Jubilees among the Dead Sea Scrolls, followed this solar calendar in practice. Their entire ritual life was structured around it. The scrolls contain multiple examples of feast schedules, Sabbath lists, and priestly rotations that reflect the 364-day model. To them, time was not a circle of seasons. It was a sacred grid. The most famous festival debate in Jubilees concerns Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. In traditional Judaism, its date shifts depending on the lunar calendar. In Jubilees, it is always fixed the 15th day of the 3rd month. Period. No variation, no drift. Celebrating it on any other day according to the text is not just incorrect, it is profane. The reason for this rigidity is theological. In Jubilees, the festivals commemorate cosmic events. Shavuot marks not just the wheat harvest, but the covenant with Noah, the giving of the law, and the self-offering of patriarchs who aligned themselves with divine time. These aren't historical accidents, they're time-stamped revelations. Change the date and you sever the connection. Some scholars suggest this obsession with calendrical accuracy reflects a deeper anxiety. During the Second Temple period, Jewish communities were fragmented. Temple control was contested. Prophetic silence hung heavy. In such a landscape, keeping the right time became a way to keep faith itself. If the priesthood was compromised, the calendar could still guide the remnant. Others see it as an ideological rebellion. By asserting a superior calendar, the authors of Jubilees were undermining the legitimacy of the temple elite. They weren't just suggesting a better method. They were suggesting the current leaders had lost the divine thread altogether. It's a gentle revolt, no swords, no curses, just dates. But in the politics of sacred time, that was enough. There's also a more mysterious layer. Jubilees claims the 364-day calendar mirrors the pattern of heaven, that the angels too celebrate the feasts on these exact days. The festivals are not just earthly traditions, they are echoes of celestial rites. When you observe them on time, you join in a chorus that spans dimensions. When you miss them, you fall out of sync not just with God, but with the entire cosmos. This concept has deep roots in Jewish mysticism and would later influence esoteric strands of Christianity and Islam. The idea that time itself is sacred architecture, that keeping the calendar is a form of worship, did not begin or end with Jubilees. But here it's presented with unparalleled clarity. And so the feast days, Passover, Shavuot, Tabernacles, the Day of Atonement, become more than commemorations. They are checkpoints, appointments, moments when heaven opens slightly wider and presence descends. The idea that these moments could be misplaced by something as seemingly innocent as a drifting moon, it terrified the authors. It was to them like misdialing heaven's number. You might still pray. you might still fast. But no one was listening. So when you next glance at a calendar, consider what you're actually holding. Not just a tool for organizing errands and meetings, but a map of sacred terrain, a blueprint, a liturgy, and if Jubilees is right, a countdown. It would be easy to imagine the Book of Jubilees as a quiet, apolitical text, just another dusty scroll filled with angels, ancient timelines, and obscure genealogies. But beneath its calm surface lies a slow-burning rebellion. Because while it never names its enemies directly, Jubilees points its quiet fury at a specific target: the temple priests in Jerusalem. The text never raises its voice. It doesn't denounce with curses or name names. Instead, it undercuts. It rewrites. It reassigns sacred authority from the center of institutional power to the margins of memory and calendar. It places blame not on foreign kings or pagan idols, but on the very people tasked with guarding the covenant. The priests, according to Jubilees, are not merely in error. They are out of time. This becomes clearest in its obsession with the calendar. As previously seen, Jubilees insists that the correct reckoning of time is 364 days. The lunar-based calendar, followed by the temple authorities, corrupt, inconsistent, destined to lead Israel astray. And when time drifts, so does everything else. Sacrifices are offered on the wrong days. Festivals misalign. The sacred rhythm so central to covenantal life is broken, but Jubilees doesn't stop at suggesting that the priests are mistaken. It implies that their failure is willful, that somewhere along the line they abandoned the original calendar and chose one more convenient or more aligned with political necessity. This isn't just an oversight, it's a betrayal. The critique is subtle but devastating. In the theology of Jubilees, timekeeping isn't bureaucratic. It's sacred. Whoever controls the calendar determines when people meet with God, when they atone, when they rest, when they celebrate. By accusing the temple priests of using the wrong calendar, Jubilees is accusing them of leading the people into sin, not by teaching idolatry, but by scheduling it. There's an echo here of the watchers, the angels, who in their impatience introduced knowledge too early and disrupted the cosmic order. The priests, like those fallen angels, have tampered with timing. They've stepped outside their appointed role. And the consequences ripple not just through society, but through the heavens. This tension plays out in the text's portrayal of patriarchal worship. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all build altars. They offer sacrifices. They observe festivals. And they do so in precise alignment with the 364-day calendar. No temple, no priesthood, just faithful men in sacred time. The message is clear: the legitimacy of worship does not depend on location or lineage. It depends on timing and obedience. In fact, Jubilees seems to intentionally decentralize holiness. Instead of elevating the temple as the locus of divine presence, it elevates memory, record-keeping, calendar awareness. If you know when to worship and how, then you can build an altar anywhere and meet God there. This idea would have been deeply unsettling to the temple establishment. Their power rested on geography and exclusivity. They controlled access to sacrifices, to festivals, to atonement. Jubilees cuts through that monopoly. It suggests that true worship isn't mediated by priests, but by those who keep the correct time. This helps explain why the book was preserved at Qumran. The community there, widely believed to be insane, had separated themselves from the temple system. They saw it as corrupt, compromised, unclean. Jubilees provided the theological justification for their withdrawal. It said, in effect, "You're not rebels. You're the faithful remnant." One of the most curious clues to this conflict is the repeated emphasis on the law written on the heavenly tablets. This phrase appears again and again in Jubilees, as if to say the true law does not reside in the scrolls of the temple scribes. It is etched in eternity. And no human priest, no matter how richly robed or loudly proclaimed, can alter what has been written in heaven. The priests in Jerusalem may control the altar, but in Jubilees, the altar is only holy if it's lit on the right day. Scholars continue to debate how explicit this critique really is. Some argue that Jubilees was merely part of a wider tradition of legal interpretation, not a manifesto. Others point to its alignment with other Qumran texts like the Temple Scroll and the Damascus document as evidence of a deliberate polemic. Either way, the result is the same, a subtle but radical reimagining of religious authority. One passage in particular highlights the tension. It recounts how Jacob, far from the promised land, builds an altar and celebrates the Festival of Tabernacles without a priest, without a temple, and without question. He is blessed. His actions are affirmed. It's a quiet revolution performed in the wilderness on the correct date under the right stars. That story, like so many others in Jubilees, sends a message to its readers: you don't need the temple to be holy. You need memory. You need the calendar. You need alignment. So the next time someone tells you that worship is about place, about who stands at the front of the room, or who holds the keys to the sanctuary, remember the quiet resistance of Jubilees. It isn't loud. It doesn't shout. But it remembers the date. And that, in the end, is where true authority lies. If you want to control a people, you don't start with swords. You start with time. Calendars shape everything: when to plant, when to rest, when to gather, when to grieve. And in the world of Jubilees, time isn't neutral. It's contested. Sacred days, appointed feasts, and Jubilee cycles form not just the scaffolding of religious life, but the very battlefield over which legitimacy is claimed. This wasn't just a theoretical idea. In the centuries leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish society was fractured by sectarian tension. Beneath arguments over theology and purity lay a deeper divide, one centered on how to count the days. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and others all measured time differently. The calendar became the point of fracture, and with it, the authority to declare what was sacred. Jubilees enters this fray with unflinching clarity. It doesn't propose a new calendar. It asserts the calendar, the one given to Enoch, followed by Noah, kept by Abraham, and dictated by angels. A 364-day solar model, 4 equal quarters, 52 perfect weeks, and festivals that never drift, never change, never fall out of alignment with the stars. This isn't just fastidious timekeeping. It's theological war. According to Jubilees, any deviation from this model isn't an alternative. It's a betrayal. And those who follow the lunar calendar, namely the priests operating the temple in Jerusalem, are not mistaken. They are corrupt. Their sacrifices are misaligned. Their festivals are false. It's worth pausing here to understand just how subversive this is. The temple wasn't merely a place of worship. It was the axis of Jewish life. The priesthood claimed direct descent from Aaron. Their authority rested not just on bloodline, but on their exclusive access to the altar, the sacrifices, the inner sanctuary. To accuse them of scheduling the holy days incorrectly was to accuse them of desecrating the very foundation of their power. Jubilees doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Its critique comes in the form of precise dating. It places key events in the lives of the patriarchs, sacrifices, festivals, visions on exact days and weeks within its calendrical system. Each detail is a rebuke to the floating feasts of the temple establishment. Every timestamp is a quiet declaration, this is the right way. Everything else is error. The stakes go beyond ritual. In the world of Jubilees, timekeeping is covenant keeping. Sacred time is the framework upon which divine presence depends. When you celebrate Passover on the wrong day, you don't just miss a holiday, you break the cycle. You step out of sync with heaven. And heaven, according to Jubilees, is always watching. This turns the calendar into a weapon, a method of protest. The Qumran community understood this well. Separated from the temple, they organized their entire society around the solar calendar. Their priests, their Sabbaths, their rituals all carefully timed according to the 365-day model. They considered themselves the true Israel, the faithful remnant, and Jubilees was their manifesto. One passage often overlooked underscores the gravity of the war. It speaks of a time when people will forget the new moons, the seasons, and the Sabbaths, and in forgetting, they will bring destruction upon themselves. This isn't about negligence. It's about dislocation. To forget the sacred calendar is to lose the map. And yet this war over time isn't just external, it's internal. Jubilees suggests that the people themselves will be deceived, that they will trust in the wrong leaders, follow the wrong feasts, and believe they are obedient even as they walk further into error. The enemy is not always Babylon. Sometimes it's the calendar hanging in the sanctuary. This framing makes Jubilees feel eerily modern. In a world saturated by time, alarm clocks schedules fiscal years, our own lives are shaped by systems we rarely examine. We assume the calendar is a given, but Jubilees reminds us it's not. Timekeeping is a choice, and every choice carries a theology. What day is holy, what hour is sacred, who decides? Jubilees offers its answer with quiet certainty. Time was structured at creation, preserved by angels, reaffirmed through patriarchs, and anyone who alters it, even with good intentions, steps outside the covenant. Some scholars have tried to soften this message. They argue that Jubilees reflects an idealized past, not a practical program. But the consistency of its structure, the absolute clarity of its claims, and the fact that real communities like Qumran built their lives around it suggest otherwise. This was no fantasy. It was resistance, and it leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. The fiercest battles for the soul of a people are often fought not with fire or sword, but with calendars and clocks. So when you next glance at the date, ask yourself, who wrote this schedule? Whose time are you keeping? Because according to Jubilees, heaven already has one. It whispers, but the target is clear. The Book of Jubilees doesn't announce itself as a manifesto. It cloaks its boldest critiques in ancient narrative, veiling its challenge beneath the robes of Abraham and the festivals of Enoch. But for those who read closely, especially during the Second Temple period, it becomes hard to miss the true function of the text. Jubilees wasn't just scripture, it was a weapon. One shaped for a very particular battlefield. To understand its edge, you have to look beyond the page and into the desert. There, among the cliffs of Qumran, a community of Jews, likely Essenes, separated themselves from the Jerusalem establishment. They left behind the temple, the priesthood, and the city's lunar calendar. In its place, they established their own order, their own priests, their own feasts, their own schedule. And at the heart of that structure was the Book of Jubilees. It wasn't an accessory. It was foundational. Multiple copies of Jubilees were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than most of the prophets, more than many canonical texts. It was read, copied, preserved, and likely recited in communal worship. Why? Because it told their version of the story. It validated their claim that the mainstream had gone astray, and that they, though small and scattered, were keeping the true covenant alive. Every line of Jubilees reinforces this stance. Its genealogy of time, its denunciation of calendar errors, its angelic oversight. All of it points to one conclusion: those who do not follow the 364-day rhythm are not just incorrect, they are outside the covenant. This wasn't a gentle theological disagreement. It was a disqualification. The Qumran sect saw themselves as sons of light, the priests in Jerusalem sons of darkness. That language appears in other scrolls like the War Scroll, but the ideology behind it is rooted in texts like Jubilees. This book gave them the framework to interpret their exile not as defeat, but as purity. They had left the temple not because they were rebels, but because the temple had fallen into error. This helps explain the careful focus on patriarchal obedience. By emphasizing that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and even Noah observed the law long before Moses' Jubilees makes a powerful claim: the temple has no monopoly on holiness. Lineage and geography mean nothing without correct observance. The Qumran community didn't need the temple because they had the calendar, the law, the pattern. One of the more pointed choices in Jubilees is its almost total silence on the priesthood as it existed in its own day. There are no stories of high priests, no affirmations of Jerusalem's authority. Instead, all the glory is placed in the past, in the acts of righteous patriarchs, guided by angels, not Levites. This absence is damning. By not mentioning them, Jubilees erases the current temple hierarchy from the sacred story altogether. Scholars continue to debate whether Jubilees originated within the Qumran community or was simply adopted by them. But the alignment is uncanny. The legal rigor, the calendrical absolutism, the anti-establishment posture wrapped in sacred narrative, all of it fits the profile of a community seeking not just separation, but vindication. That's why some describe Jubilees as sectarian scripture. Not because it's hateful or violent, but because it draws sharp lines. It offers comfort to those outside the mainstream by saying you are not latecomers or radicals. You are the keepers of the original time. Of course, the Jerusalem priests likely saw it differently. To them, the solar calendar was a relic. The lunar system worked. It kept the festivals close to the seasons. It had flexibility, practicality. The temple needed to function, and a static calendar didn't leave much room for reign or revolt. So Jubilees became dangerous, not because it called for rebellion, but because it called for realignment. It gave theological teeth to those on the margins. It told a different story of time, one where legitimacy didn't come from incense and altars, but from adherence to rhythms older than Moses, older than Sinai, embedded in creation itself. There's something almost poetic about it. A text so obsessed with order written in a time of chaos. A book that seeks to restore divine precision in a world of shifting empires, corrupt rulers, and fading traditions. For its followers, Jubilees was more than scripture. It was a lifeline, a way to keep time when everything else was falling apart. And perhaps that's why it was eventually excluded from the canon. It wasn't heretical. It was destabilizing. Jubilees didn't ask to be accepted. It dared to claim it had never left. So was it a sectarian weapon, quietly, absolutely, but not one forged in anger, one forged in memory. The Western world forgot. The rabbis excluded it, the church fathers ignored it, and for most of Christian and Jewish history, the Book of Jubilees disappeared from public view, just another ancient curiosity lost in the tides of canon wars and theological consolidation. But in Ethiopia, it never left. While Rome trimmed the biblical canon and Alexandria debated Greek translations, the Ethiopian church preserved a different sacred library, broader, older in some ways, and far more open to books that others found uncomfortable. Jubilees, known there as the Book of Divisions, wasn't an apocryphal curiosity. It was scripture. It was read in churches, copied by scribes, cited by priests. For over a millennium, it remained active in the liturgical life of Ethiopian Christianity. Not just as a reference or a historical note, but as one of the foundational texts through which creation, covenant, and chronology were understood. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains a biblical canon that includes Jubilees as fully authoritative alongside Enoch, another book long buried in the West. Why Ethiopia? Why did this corner of the Christian world preserve what others cast aside? The answer is both historical and theological. Ethiopia's Christian tradition dates back to the earliest centuries of the faith, possibly as far as the 1st or 2nd century CE. Its geographical distance from Roman and Byzantine centers of power gave it freedom to develop independently, less affected by the theological controversies and political pressures that shaped the Western canon. It didn't participate in the Council of Nicaea or the later ecumenical councils that pruned and curated Christian doctrine. Instead, Ethiopia grew its canon from what it received and preserved. Early Jewish Christian texts carried south by migrating communities or missionaries found a long-term home in the Ethiopian highlands. And in that context, Jubilees didn't seem controversial. It made sense. Its angels, its feasts, its obsessive structure of time, these weren't distractions. They were the framework. In fact, Ethiopia's strong emphasis on Sabbath observance, dietary law, and sacred calendar aligns strikingly well with Jubilees' theology. While Western Christianity emphasized grace over law and spirit over structure, Ethiopian Christianity retained more of the Hebraic foundation of the faith. In this context, Jubilees wasn't legalistic. It was faithful. There's a historical irony here almost too poetic to ignore. While the learned theologians of Europe and the Middle East debated the philosophical implications of Augustine or the allegories of Origen, Ethiopian monks were still reading Enoch, still copying Jubilees, still teaching that time was sacred and creation followed a divine blueprint. And perhaps that continuity was the point. In Jubilees, memory is everything. Forgetting the festivals, the appointed days, the heavenly order, these are not minor lapses. They are fractures in the covenant. To remember is to remain inside the story. Ethiopia remembered. And in doing so, it preserved not only a book, but a worldview, a way of understanding the universe as ordered, intentional, and angelically observed. A way of seeing the law not as a burden, but as a bridge connecting earth and heaven across cycles and jubilees. This wasn't without tension. Western missionaries who arrived in Ethiopia during the colonial and post-colonial periods often viewed Jubilees as apocryphal and sought to discourage its use. But the text had already sunk deep roots, and like the mountains that protected Ethiopia from countless invasions, the tradition held. Quietly, persistently. One could argue that the Ethiopian embrace of Jubilees is less about doctrinal precision and more about cultural memory, that the book resonates because it speaks to a form of Christianity that never severed itself from the rhythms of the ancient world. In Ethiopia, the calendar still matters. The feasts are still tied to agricultural seasons. Time is still sacred. And so Jubilees continues not as a relic, but as a living text, sung in churches, translated into Ge'ez, hand-copied in monasteries that cling to cliff faces like ancient outposts of another era. This preservation raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of us. What else have we lost? Not through fire or violence, but through silence, because sometimes the books that challenge the center are safest at the edges. So while the West dug up Jubilees from a cave in Qumran, dusted it off, and filed it under Apocrypha. Ethiopia never buried it, never doubted it. It remembered. And in doing so, perhaps it kept something the rest of the world was never meant to forget. It's subtle at first. A phrase here, a warning there. Jubilees doesn't open with thunder or close with fire. But beneath its carefully ordered chronology and ritual precision lies a pulse steady, ominous, and unmistakably apocalyptic. Not in the way of Revelation's beasts and trumpets, but in something colder, more bureaucratic, more inevitable. Because in Jubilees, the end of the world doesn't arrive like a catastrophe. It arrives like a deadline. The book is saturated with time markers. Jubilees, weeks, seasons, and days, every action of humanity is measured, recorded, and weighed. But as the narrative unfolds, those measurements begin to point toward something, a final correction, a last cycle, a judgment not just on individuals, but on the timeline itself. This isn't chaos, it's accounting. Unlike other apocalyptic texts that focus on visions, battles, and cosmic upheaval, Jubilees builds its end times narrative through structure, the sin of the watchers, the corruption of the calendar, the forgetting of festivals. All of it adds up. Like ledgers left open too long, the violations accumulate, and at a certain point, when the balance tips, heaven will not react emotionally. It will simply act. In this version of the world, there is no divine panic, no rushed intervention. Everything has its appointed time, including the final reckoning. And that's what gives the book its quiet dread. It doesn't shout that the end is coming. It reminds you that it's already on the schedule. The final chapters of Jubilees include increasingly urgent language. The righteous will be vindicated. The wicked will be judged. But this is not a spontaneous event. It's a convergence, a culmination of patterns that have been building since Eden. When people forget the appointed times, ignore the Sabbaths, and distort the festivals, they aren't just sinning. They're destabilizing the architecture of creation. And creation, like any structure, can only take so much imbalance before it collapses or resets. This is why the book is so obsessed with memory. To forget the law is to invite destruction, but not in a fire from heaven sense, more like rot in the beams of a building. Slow, inevitable, structural. And yet the book doesn't end in despair. Tucked within the warnings is a quiet confidence in restoration. The righteous, those who keep the proper calendar and honor the sacred times, will be protected. Jubilees insists that even when the temple is defiled and the feasts forgotten, a remnant will remain. A people who still remember. This remnant isn't marked by power or position. It's marked by timing. The faithful are those who continue to live by the original rhythm even when the world forgets the beat. That's the true apocalyptic edge of Jubilees, not fire, not flood, but the slow, calm severing of those who live in sync and those who don't. It's a vision of the end that feels eerily modern. No dragons, no earthquakes, just a world drifting further and further out of alignment until one day it doesn't recognize the time anymore. And when that day comes, the text implies heaven will realign it. Not with thunder, but with precision. Some scholars believe this end times framework was designed to comfort the Qumran community. They lived in exile physically and spiritually. The temple was run by those they considered corrupt. The calendar, the sacrifices, the festivals, none of it was right. But Jubilees told them, hold the line. Keep the time. When the judgment comes, the records will show who remembered. Others argue that the apocalyptic elements in Jubilees reflect a deeper unease in Jewish thought at the time. The Second Temple period was marked by imperial domination, cultural pressure, and theological uncertainty. And when the center can no longer hold, people don't just predict collapse, they begin to schedule it. Even the punishments in Jubilees are measured. The watchers are bound for 70 generations. The nations that oppress Israel are allowed to flourish for a time, but not forever. There is no randomness, no improvisation. The end will come exactly when it's supposed to. And so the apocalyptic vision of Jubilees doesn't feel wild or hysterical. It feels calm, certain, almost administrative. The Book of Divisions, after all, is not chaos theory. It's a filing system. You won't find dragons with 7 heads or burning stars crashing into the sea. What you'll find is a divine clock ticking quietly behind the veil of history. Not out of wrath, but out of rhythm. Tick. A generation forgets the Sabbath. Tick. The priests alter the calendar. Tick. The feasts fall out of sync. Tick. The flood. Tick. The exile. Tick. The end. And through it all, the quiet voice of the angel, still narrating, still recording, still watching. Waiting not for surprise, but for alignment. As you drift deeper into the folds of Jubilees, something strange begins to happen. Familiar names emerge: Noah, Enoch, Abraham, but with unfamiliar speeches, warnings, and legacies. Then come the passing references, small at first, almost unnoticeable. Mentions of writings, scrolls, books, documents that apparently once existed, were once known, and now are simply gone. Jubilees doesn't present itself as an isolated revelation. It gestures outward, constantly pointing to a library that no longer exists. A hidden shelf of ancient writings that supported, expanded, and in some cases completely rewrote the version of sacred history you thought you knew. Take the Book of Enoch. Jubilees treats it not as myth or fringe lore, but as canonical fact. Enoch isn't just the man who walked with God. He is a scribe of heaven recording angelic revolts and divine decrees. Jubilees leans on his writings to explain the origin of the Watchers and the Nephilim, to justify God's judgment, and to lay the foundation for the flood, not as a sudden decision, but as the final stroke in a cosmic legal case. And it doesn't stop with Enoch. Jubilees refers to a Book of Noah, a testament of Jacob, and multiple writings attributed to Abraham and his sons. These aren't stylized footnotes. They are woven directly into the fabric of the story. Noah delivers prophecies not found in Genesis. Abraham warns his descendants with a clarity and detail that feels rehearsed, as if he's reading from a record passed down. Which raises an unsettling possibility. If these books once circulated among the early communities of Israel, where did they go? Were they forgotten, naturally pushed aside by editorial decisions, or actively erased? The answer, as always, depends on who was in charge. The Jewish canon, as we know it today, was shaped in stages, some oral, some written, many political. By the time the Second Temple stood, certain books had become dominant. Others faded. Still others, like Enoch and Jubilees, were actively suppressed. The early rabbis found them too speculative, too mystical, too dangerous. The early church agreed, labeling many of these writings as apocryphal, pseudepigraphal, or worse, heretical. And yet they survived. Not in the West, perhaps, but in Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church preserved both Jubilees and Enoch. In Gnostic sects who referenced lost books to challenge official doctrine. And in dusty caves near Qumran, where someone believed they were worth hiding, perhaps for a future generation who would finally understand. There's something tragic in it, a sense that the full archive of human-divine interaction was once wider, deeper, more complex. That we've inherited only the centerpieces, the politically safe stories, while the raw, speculative, provocative texts were locked away. One reference in Jubilees stands out. It describes how Enoch was shown the heavenly tablets records of everything past and future. These weren't just books. They were blueprints, instructions, legal scrolls written by angels unreadable to most eyes, except those anointed to receive them. Enoch read them. Moses perhaps too. And in Jubilees, the angel dictating to Moses claims that this act, writing down the divine order, is what protects creation from unraveling. That's the core anxiety beneath the surface. That forgetting these books isn't just a loss of knowledge. It's a fracture in the foundation. And perhaps that's why Jubilees keeps mentioning them. Not to show off its sources, but to mourn their absence. To whisper again and again that something vital has been lost. Modern scholars have tried to reconstruct this missing canon, piecing together fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, comparing themes across apocryphal texts, cross-referencing Ethiopic versions with Aramaic traces. But much remains speculation. We know, for instance, that a book of the wars of the Lord is mentioned in Numbers, that a book of Jasher appears in Joshua and Samuel, that multiple patriarchs are described as writing down visions, laws, and genealogies never seen again. And each reference is like a ghost, a reminder that the Bible was not always one book, but a battlefield of books. Competing scrolls, rival visions, divergent truths. Jubilees doesn't pretend to be neutral in this fight. It positions itself as the faithful custodian of the original rhythm, the Book of Time. And it treats the missing works not as curiosities, but as casualties, victims of corruption, conquest, or censorship. But for those willing to listen, it leaves trails, echoes, a hint that the full story is still out there, scattered in pieces, waiting to be remembered. Like a broken constellation, you only see glimpses. A prophecy from Noah, a calendar correction from Enoch, a blessing from Isaac never heard in Sunday school. And the question lingers, if we had those books, if we could read the whole archive, would our entire understanding of covenant law and creation shift? Maybe that's what the angel meant when he said to Moses, "Write this down. For it is not only for your sons, but for the last days." Maybe Jubilees was never meant to stand alone. Maybe it was meant to lead you back. If the Book of Jubilees was truly buried, it did a poor job staying quiet. Like a whisper that refuses to fade, its words have bled through cracks in the canon, seeping into the world's most influential scriptures. Sometimes blatantly, sometimes so subtly you'd never know you were hearing an echo. And the more closely you listen, the harder it is to believe that Jubilees was ever fully erased. Start with the Bible itself. That might seem contradictory. After all, Jubilees isn't in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. But open the pages of Genesis, Exodus, even Chronicles, and you'll find peculiar resonances. There are phrases, turns of genealogy, and unique theological emphases that make more sense if Jubilees was a source. Consider the highly structured genealogies, the focus on exact lifespans, or the meticulous calendar notes elements that feel almost compulsive. In Jubilees, that obsession with order is central. In Genesis, it's oddly present but often unexplained. Then there's the New Testament. The Gospel of Luke, for example, includes a genealogy of Jesus that stretches all the way back to Adam. That might seem like a charming literary flourish until you realize Jubilees places enormous weight on genealogical continuity as the vessel of divine favor. In fact, Jubilees emphasizes genealogical purity to such an extent that it becomes the vehicle for salvation history. The echoes are faint but familiar. Jude, the shortest book in the New Testament, quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, a sibling text of Jubilees mentioning the prophecy of Enoch 7th from Adam, who foretold divine judgment. That reference alone suggests early Christians had access to and valued texts from the same family as Jubilees. It also opens a doorway. If Enoch survived long enough to be cited by Jude, why wouldn't Jubilees have made the rounds as well? And then there's the Quran. Though written centuries later, and in a radically different theological framework, the Quran shares some uncanny themes with Jubilees. The intense focus on sacred time, for instance the lunar and solar calendar debate, echoes faintly in Islamic traditions of moon sighting for Ramadan. The emphasis on divine law preceding Moses, the idea that Abraham received revelations beyond the Torah, the presence of angels as active guides in human history, all of these are central in Jubilees and subtly mirrored in the Quran. It gets stranger with the Gnostic texts. Buried for centuries near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, these works like the Gospel of Truth or the Apocryphon of John share a common language with Jubilees. There's talk of hidden knowledge, heavenly realms governed by layers of angels, and a divine architecture of time. Even though Gnosticism diverged wildly from the structured legalism of Jubilees, both traditions seem to work from a premise that the visible world is a fractured mirror of a higher-ordered reality. That what's been handed down is only a sliver of what was meant to be known. Which leads to the unsettling implication: if Jubilees was influential enough to echo in Scripture across three major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, why was it removed? More importantly, how did it manage to survive without being openly quoted, attributed, or canonized? Perhaps that was the strategy. Not erasure, but absorption. A slow blending of its concepts into other texts, until no one could trace the origin. After all, not every legacy needs a nameplate. Some of the most powerful ideas work best when they're untraceable, sounding like ancient memory rather than doctrine. Modern scholars now admit what was once denied: that Jubilees was likely part of the scriptural environment of Second Temple Judaism, that it shaped beliefs about angels, time, and law even if it wasn't quoted by name, that communities like the Essenes who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls considered it authoritative. That echoes of it appear not just in sacred texts, but in oral traditions, liturgical practices, and commentaries stretching centuries beyond its disappearance. One small example: the tradition of heavenly tablets, divine records written before time began. It sounds fantastical. And yet this motif appears in Jubilees and Enoch, in some rabbinic midrash, and even subtly in Revelation, where books are opened, names are listed, and judgments are rendered based on preordained inscriptions. If you draw the lines between them, Jubilees, Enoch, the Quran, Revelation, Genesis, you begin to see not a tree with clear branches, but a web. A network of ideas that pulse beneath the surface, unacknowledged but undeniable. In that sense, Jubilees may have been more successful than its editors feared. Suppressed, yes. Forgotten by some. But never quite dead. Like an echo bouncing through a canyon, it keeps returning. Not loud, but persistent. Not center stage, but never entirely off it. And maybe that's the ultimate legacy of a book too dangerous to canonize, but too powerful to destroy. Its fingerprints remain on texts that billions now hold sacred. Its rhythms still beat beneath religious time. Its words, though buried, continue to whisper. You've heard them before. You just didn't know their name. You've followed the text, traced its echoes, and listened to its hidden rhythms. But one question now looms like a shadow cast backward across every revelation: who actually wrote the Book of Jubilees? Was it really dictated to Moses atop a trembling mountain by an angel cloaked in celestial fire? Or was that claim, like so many in ancient religious literature, a literary device to grant authority to something much more earthly? To answer that, you have to peer through three lenses at once: the mythic, the historical, and the political. Let's begin with what the book itself says. According to its narrative frame, Jubilees was delivered to Moses by the angel of the presence, no ordinary messenger, but a being said to stand directly before the throne of God. This angel unfolds the entire story of the world from creation to Moses' own time, structured in 49-year jubilees like a divine ledger of history. The goal, supposedly, is to teach the Israelites not only their origins, but how time itself reflects God's will. From the book's own perspective, Moses is not the author at all. He is the scribe, the receiver, the servant at the end of a long chain of heavenly order. But very few scholars today believe this was literally true. Most agree Jubilees was composed sometime between 160 and 140 BCE, during the height of the Second Temple period, in the years following the Maccabean revolt. This places it in a world of political upheaval, sectarian fragmentation, and renewed obsession with purity calendar disputes and priestly authority. Not exactly the environment you'd expect for angelic dictation, but precisely the kind of setting where Scripture could become a weapon. Which raises another theory that the true author of Jubilees was a member of the priestly elite. Possibly a Zadokite, possibly someone affiliated with the Essenes, those ascetic separatists who fled to the wilderness and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes are known for their obsession with sacred calendars, angelic hierarchies, and a dualistic view of cosmic good and evil. Sound familiar? If this was their manifesto, it would explain a great deal. Jubilees elevates Enoch, Noah, and Abraham as legal, prophetic, and almost priestly figures, champions of divine order before the Mosaic law was even given. That's not just reverence. It's a repositioning of authority. It says the covenant doesn't begin with Moses or the temple in Jerusalem. It begins earlier, purer, beyond your grasp. This undermines the legitimacy of the Jerusalem priesthood, subtly challenging their monopoly on ritual law and religious time. There's another strange feature of the text, its language. Jubilees was originally written in Hebrew, not Greek or Aramaic, despite those being more commonly used at the time for popular texts. But this wasn't the Hebrew of kings and prophets. It was an archaising form, intentionally old-fashioned, as if the writer wanted to simulate the diction of ancient scripture. In modern terms, imagine writing a political manifesto entirely in Shakespearean English. It's not for style, it's to project authority, to sound older than you are, to claim continuity with the divine. And then there's the legal tone. Jubilees is obsessed with rules, rituals, and regulations. It doesn't merely tell stories, it explains what was permitted, what was forbidden, and when. Almost every patriarch is reimagined as a proto-observer of the Mosaic law. Abraham celebrates Passover before the Exodus ever occurs. Jacob honors Yom Kippur before Sinai is even a rumor. This isn't narrative flair. It's ideology. It's revisionist theology carefully designed to project an unbroken line of sacred law from the dawn of time to the present. Convenient if you happen to be a priest defending your faction's interpretation of the calendar. But there's one final theory, one last veil to consider. What if it wasn't a priest at all? What if Jubilees was the product of a small scribal community, one that saw itself as the true remnant, the last keepers of divine order in a world gone mad? They may have believed they were recording a revealed truth, even if no angel appeared to them in fire. Perhaps they fasted, prayed, studied fragments of older texts, and pieced together a vision of cosmic time that reflected both their faith and their fears. Maybe they were exiles, political, spiritual, or both, building a portable sanctuary in scrolls, since no temple would accept them. This view doesn't contradict the others. It deepens them. Whether they were Essenes, Zadokites, or some unnamed splinter, their vision was clear. The world had fallen off its axis, and only by returning to the primordial rhythms of God measured in jubilees guarded by angels could it be restored. Ironically, in attempting to erase them, history may have proved their point. The temple they rejected was destroyed. The calendar they condemned shifted again. And the book they composed, thinking it would correct the timeline of heaven, was buried under centuries of dust, waiting to be heard again. So who wrote Jubilees? A priest, a scribe, an angel, perhaps all three, perhaps none. But someone somewhere believed that time itself was a covenant, and they dared to write it down. Now that the layers have been peeled back, the parchments lifted, the timelines rewound, and the angels summoned, what are you left holding? A book, yes, but not merely a book. The Book of Jubilees is more like a schematic, a coded blueprint tucked between creation myths and calendars, tracing a forgotten architecture of divine intent. And the closer you look, the more it begins to whisper something strange, that this wasn't just a record of the past. It was a map of a hidden covenant, one carefully drawn beneath the surface of time. From the opening verses, you were told this book came from heaven itself. An angel dictated it to Moses, not just any angel, but the angel of the presence, the one who stood eternally in front of God's throne. That claim, while dramatic, signaled something deeper than celestial theatrics. It established authority, yes, but more than that, it declared the book's real ambition to reorder the sacred universe, not by rewriting events, but by revealing how those events were embedded in time itself. Time in Jubilees isn't a backdrop, it's the message. The entire narrative is built around cycles, 49-year jubilees, 7-year Sabbaths, exact dates for births, deaths, oaths, and divine interventions. When Noah receives laws, it's on a specific day. When Abraham swears a covenant, it's on a day destined for ritual. Every moment is anchored. Every action is part of a cosmic rhythm. And if you stray from that rhythm even by a day, you fall out of sync with the divine order. This was more than a historical retelling. It was a corrective lens. Jubilees wasn't content to simply record the past. It wanted to harmonize it, to bring creation, law, covenant, and prophecy into one flowing structure where nothing was accidental. If the Book of Genesis showed how the world began, the Book of Jubilees explained how it was supposed to operate. What emerges from this architecture is a vision of covenant that transcends the individual. Abraham's faith, Noah's righteousness, even Moses' obedience, they all matter, yes. But in Jubilees, those virtues are part of something grander, a binding system of sacred law built into the very fabric of time. The covenant isn't a single promise. It's a framework, legal, ritualistic, and cosmic. To live within it isn't just to believe. It's to walk in rhythm with the universe. But Jubilees goes further. It's not content with legal structure. It embeds that structure in angelic oversight. Throughout the book, angels are not simply messengers, they are timekeepers, lawgivers, guardians of ritual, and watchers of human behavior. The same angel who dictated the text is the one who monitors whether humanity follows it. This paints a striking picture that divine law is not merely written, it is actively enforced, watched over, measured against the clock, and it casts a new light on the book's most radical claims. That the Torah was not first revealed at Sinai, but known since the days of the patriarchs. That the calendar used by the temple priests was wrong, a corruption of the original solar rhythm. That Israel's festivals were rooted not in tribal custom, but in celestial alignment. Each of these assertions feeds into the same architecture, one where divine will is mathematical observable and woven into the very cycles of light and shadow. This is where the blueprint sharpens into a challenge. If time itself is sacred, then those who control its measurement control access to God. Jubilees isn't just disputing dates, it's attacking the legitimacy of a priesthood, a calendar, an entire religious establishment. It argues that to forget the original rhythm is to sever the covenant entirely. And in doing so, it becomes more than a scroll. It becomes a manifesto. So what does this mean for us now, centuries removed from its authors and disputes? You've seen how Jubilees echoes through lost gospels, through Ethiopian liturgies, even into modern apocalyptic imagination. But perhaps its most enduring gift is the question it asks. In silence, what if sacredness isn't only in the story, but in the structure? In the timing, in the repetition of rituals that align not just with history, but with the rhythm of stars? It's a question that lingers even now. Because to read Jubilees is to wonder if we've misunderstood what covenant ever meant. Not just law, not just promise, but pattern, precision, presence. In the silence between feasts, in the shadow between Sabbaths, in the margins of a calendar, few remember we may still be walking through a design older than Moses. A forgotten geometry of faith. A book of time waiting to be reread. So now here you are, at the quiet edge of a long journey. The scrolls have been unrolled, the candles burned low. The whispers of angels, the rhythm of sacred time. The footsteps of patriarchs counted not in years, but in jubilees, all now rest again in silence. What was once buried beneath desert stone and temple politics has unfolded before you, gently, deliberately, like the turning of stars overhead. You've seen how a single forgotten book tried to realign creation itself, how it framed covenant not as chaos or charisma, but as cadence, how angels recorded sins on tablets of light and sacred festivals were meant to echo the very heartbeat of the universe. You've stepped between lost timelines, touched the fingertips of prophets and scribes, and listened as a voice not Moses's, but one that claimed heaven laid out a different foundation. One ruled by law light and the geometry of divine memory. And now that you've heard it, you might feel it still lingering, that tug at the edge of understanding, that soft sense that history once had a pattern we've forgotten how to read. But let it go for now. Let your mind slow like sand settling after a windstorm. Let the ancient names fade into soft vowels. Let the constellations of covenant dim just slightly. Let the parchments close their pages, folding back into a hush older than language. You've walked far enough for tonight. In the stillness that follows a secret, there is peace. And somewhere just outside the reach of memory, the Book of Jubilees waits again.